History as it happens, January 25th, 2024. The economy, stupid.
Most people are working harder for less money than they were making 10 years ago. It is because we are in the grip of a failed economic theory.
That's it. Game, set, match. It's over. We will have a new president of the United States.
We inherit an economy that is still the world's strongest, but is weakened by business failures, stagnant wages, increasing inequality, and deep divisions among our own people.
There will be a giant sucking sound going south.
Estimates say NAFTA will cost up to $40 billion for environmental cleanup, worker retraining.
We'll be sending a signal to the world that Americans don't shrink away from competition.
The U.S. will export more jobs to Mexico
so that we can control health care costs and provide every American with affordable, high-quality medical care.
Our products will gain better access to China's market in every sector, from agriculture to telecommunications to automobiles. The era of big government is over.
If you remember the 1990s as a time of economic prosperity, historian Nelson Lichtenstein is here to tell you Clintonomics was a fabulous failure. The title of his book about the transformation of global capitalism, the changes that sowed the seeds of today's populist backlash. Next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Our economy is the healthiest it has been in 3 decades. We have the lowest combined rates of unemployment and inflation in 27 years. We have created nearly 8 million new jobs, over 1 million of them in basic industries like construction and automobiles.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to make absolutely clear that yes, the late 90s were a very favorable moment. They call it the Goldilocks economy, not too hot, not too cold. But I do think, and the whole point of the book is that this was sort of built on sand.
Thank you very much.
A little more than 30 years ago, September 14th, 1993, the scene is the White House.
I would like to acknowledge just a couple of other people who are in the audience because I think they deserve to be seen by Americans.
President Bill Clinton, 9 months into his first term with former Presidents Ford, Carter, and Bush in attendance, kicks off his campaign to get NAFTA through Congress.
Lead this fight for our administration on a bipartisan basis. Would you please stand?
And it is worth listening to his speech, for it embodies the optimism of the day and the self-confidence to harness the transformative economic and technological changes for the betterment of ordinary people.
But I want to say to my fellow Americans, when you live in a time of change, the only way to recover your security and to broaden your horizons is to adapt to the change, to embrace it, to move forward. Nothing we do in this great capital can change the fact that factories or information can flash across the world, that people can move money around in the blink of an eye. Nothing can change the fact that technology can be adopted, once created, by people all across the world and then rapidly adapted in new and different ways by people who have a little different take on the way that technology works. For 2 decades, the winds of global competition have made these things clear to any American with eyes to see. The only way we can recover the fortunes of the middle class in this country, so that people who work harder and smarter can at least prosper more. The only way we can pass on the American dream of the last 40 years to our children and their children for the next 40 is to adapt to the changes which are occurring. In a fundamental sense, this debate about NAFTA is a debate about whether we will embrace these changes and create the jobs of tomorrow, or try to resist these changes, hoping we can preserve the economic structures of yesterday. I tell you, my fellow Americans, that if we learn anything from the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the governments in Eastern Europe, even a totally controlled society cannot resist the winds of change that economics and technology and information flow have imposed in this world of ours. That is not an option. Our only realistic option is to embrace these changes and create the jobs of tomorrow.
And then came a sentence the White House would regret.
I believe that NAFTA will create 1 million jobs in the first 5 years of its impact. And I believe that that is many more jobs than will be lost.
So what was so embarrassing about what the president said there? Well, as Nelson Lichtenstein writes in his important new book, A Fabulous Failure, Clinton's staff mistakenly put before him a speech that was still incomplete, especially when it came to an estimate of the number of jobs the agreement would create, since that number was both contested and controversial within the executive branch. So the speechwriter Michael Waldman inserted the word million as a placeholder, and that is the line Clinton read at the Rose Garden event.
I believe that NAFTA will create 1 million jobs in the first 5 years of its impact.
Waldman and other White House aides were horrified, and Clinton sensed the problem as well. His eyes bulged briefly when he realized something was amiss, Waldman later wrote. He began to ad-lib. Lichtenstein goes on to write, the White House scrambled to make amends, telling reporters that the 1 million jobs figure was wrong due to a staff error. Clinton admitted the mistake and soon told the news conference that he was only prepared to say that more jobs would be gained than lost. But the 1 million jobs number stuck, taking on a life of its own that burdened Clinton in the weeks and years to come, especially as the whole NAFTA idea became increasingly controversial and within a large slice of the Democratic Party, absolutely toxic. That is Nelson Lichtenstein, the accomplished labor historian at UC Santa Barbara. He'll be here in a moment. So, we spend a lot of time talking about foreign policy on this show, but this is an election year, and the coming election will likely be decided by the same general issue that decided the 1992 election won by the former governor of Arkansas.
The economy, stupid.
Hey, wait a second. Who are you? What are you doing in here?
What are you talking about? You asked me to come in here and read that line.
Oh, well, nice job then. And there is another line from the 1992 campaign. No one ever said these words, as far as I can tell, but they defined a moment at the debate with Perot, Bush, and Clinton. I feel your pain, when an audience member asked a question.
Yes, how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them?
Now compare the wooden, defensive way Bush answered versus Clinton's answer.
Well, I'm sure it has. I love my grandchildren. I want to think that they're going to be able to afford an education. I think that that's an important part of being a parent. Maybe I won't get it wrong. Are you suggesting that if somebody has means, that the national debt doesn't affect them?
Oh, what I'm saying
I'm not sure I get it. Help me with the question, and I'll try to answer it.
I've had friends that have been laid off from jobs.
Yeah.
I know people who cannot afford to pay the mortgage on their homes, their car payment. I have personal problems with the national debt, but how has it affected you? And if you have no experience in it, how can you help us if you don't know what we're feeling?
I think she means more the recession, the economic problems today the country faces, rather than the deficit.
You ought to be in the White House for a day and hear what I hear and see what I see and read the mail I read and touch the people that I touch from time to time. I was in the Lomax AME Church. It's a black church just outside of Washington, D.C. And I read in the bulletin about teenage pregnancies, about the difficulty that families are having to make ends meet. I talked to parents. I mean, you got to care. Everybody cares if people aren't doing well. But I don't think it's fair to say you haven't had cancer, therefore you don't know what it's like. I don't think it's fair to say, whatever it is, that if you haven't been hit by it personally, but everybody's affected by the debt because of the tremendous interest that goes into paying on that debt. Everything's more expensive. Everything comes out of your pocket and my pocket. So it's that. But I think in terms of the recession, of course you feel it when you're president of the United States. And that's why I'm trying to do something about it by stimulating the export, investing more, better education systems. Thank you. I'm glad to clarify.
Tell me how it's affected you again. You know people who've lost their jobs and lost their homes? Well, I've been governor of a small state for 12 years. I'll tell you how it's affected me. Every year, Congress and the President sign laws that make us do more things, that gives us less money to do it with. I see people in my state, middle-class people, their taxes have gone up in Washington and their services have gone down, while the wealthy have gotten tax cuts.
I have seen what's happened in this last 4 years when, in my state, when people lose their jobs, there's a good chance I'll know them by their names. When a factory closes, I know the people who ran it. When the businesses go bankrupt, I know them. And I've been out here for 13 months, meeting in meetings just like this ever since October, with people like you all over America, people that have lost their jobs, lost their livelihood, lost their health insurance. What I want you to understand is the national debt is not the only cause of that. It is because America has not invested in its people. It is because we have not grown. It is because we've had 12 years of trickle-down economics. We've gone from first to 12th in the world in wages. We've had 4 years where we produced no private sector jobs. Most people are working harder for less money than they were making 10 years ago. It is because we are in the grip of a failed economic theory. And this decision you're about to make better be about what kind of economic theory you want.
The kind of economic theory you want. I bet if somebody right there said, you know, you're going to wind up being a neoliberal, Clinton would have looked at him funny. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. That debate, that whole campaign, is why William Jefferson Clinton electrified Democrats after 12 years in the wilderness, 12 years of Republican domination of the White House. But Bill Clinton would divide his party by pursuing what Lichtenstein calls neoliberal policies. Free trade, the free flow of capital in and out of developing countries, deregulation of financial markets. And he was unwilling or unable to reverse certain trends long underway before he took office, as New Deal liberalism was eclipsed by Reaganism with its anti-union, anti-welfare state politics and policies. But there is more to this story than politics. Global capitalism was changing. The Cold War was over, market economies were being born, China sought entry into the global trading system, a move championed by Clinton with the same optimism with which he championed NAFTA.
Bringing China into the WTO is a win-win decision. It will protect our prosperity, and it will promote the right kind of change in China.
Free trade and technological innovation seem to hold the answers to problems government could not or should not solve anymore. If these issues sound familiar, that's because they're many of the same issues that define our politics during this Trumpist populist moment. The consequences of NAFTA, China, asset bubbles, and more. Well, maybe more of us should have seen the tsunami coming. Some did. As Lichtenstein notes on page 431 of A Fabulous Failure, it was early October 1998, a hearing of the House Banking Committee, after the sensational collapse of the hedge fund long-term capital management. It had made risky bets in the unregulated derivatives market. And at that hearing, Lichtenstein writes, TV cameras and reporters were scarce, leading Pennsylvania Democrat Paul Kanjorski to say this.
I'd like to make an observation. A little while ago, I walked down the hall and I noticed the absence of television and other media parties here, and I was just wondering, is there any way you could inject sex into this so that we could get a little more national attention? It would seem to me, listening to testimony of Mr. Greenspan and yourself, Mr. McDowell, we're talking about the potential meltdown of the world's economic system.
So try to remember what was happening in October of 1998. The Republican-led House of Representatives was consumed with the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and they would soon start impeachment hearings.
While my answers were legally accurate, I did not volunteer information. Indeed, I did have a relationship with Ms. Lewinsky that was not appropriate. In fact, it was wrong.
Now, back to the important stuff. Listen to Kanjorski's exchange with Fed Chair Alan Greenspan about the danger of runaway derivatives and systemic failure. I mean, I don't even remember long-term capital management. But this kind of conversation would happen a decade later.
I don't think it's fair for free marketeers to say, well, we have to let the market work. If we're going to spend $270 billion a year in national defense in this country every year, and we're going to allow insurance funds to support banks who lend money to irresponsible hedge funds who can bring down the whole system, then we've got to find something to put that system so that it can't be used as a weapon against not only America but the whole world. I'd like your response to that.
I'm scarcely defending hedge funds, nor do I think that their basic purpose is other than to maximize their rate of return to their individual shareholders. But the vehicle itself, many of the things which they do in order to obtain profit are largely arbitrage type of activities which tend to refine the pricing system in the United States and elsewhere. And it is that really exceptionally and increasingly sophisticated pricing system which is one of the reasons why the use of capital in this country is so efficient. It's why productivity is the highest in the world, why our standards of living without question are the highest in the world. And I'm not saying that the cause of all of this great prosperity is the consequence of hedge funds. Obviously not. What I am saying is that there is an economic value here which is not, which we should not merely dismiss.
Greenspan, Larry Summers, Bob Rubin, and other free market masters of the universe are important characters in this story. And that is what our guest today is interested in, the origins of today's economic discontent, the bailouts of Wall Street, for instance, that helped fuel the Occupy movement, anger at the system, transcending partisan division. It exists at both ends of the political spectrum. Nelson Lichtenstein, welcome back.
Delighted to be here.
A fabulous failure. I guess that's a contradiction in terms. We'll get to your book in a moment, but just first, a word about your co-author, Judith Stein, who passed away a few years ago. How did you come to write this book upon her death?
Well, I've known Judith, who's a great historian of both race and industrial political economy, and I knew her for many decades. She died in the year 2017, and she'd begun preliminary work on this project. She had a contract with a publisher. So I wrote an obituary about her, kind of one of those sort of obituaries, which is, not so much about her. I mean, I did say she's a wonderful person, but, I'd explained her ideas, explained her where she was as an historian and what her main ideas were. And as a result of that, her agent sent me an email and said, do you want to pick up the pieces and write this book? And so it was a little complicated. The contract lapsed, but I thought, this is a good project. I actually brought my grad students. I got all my grad students together and I said, hey, what do you guys think about this? Because my grad students are definitely more in tune with what's going on than I am in a way. And we discussed it. And I wrote a book on Walmart. I've written a book on labor. I'm interested in the political economy and politics and the nature of capitalism in the second half of the 20th century. And anyway, so I began to work on this, and I found that as I did, I extended it, broadened it. I had my own interests. Unfortunately, I've collaborated with some other writers, and it's always a good thing. But here, unfortunately, Judith died. I couldn't have a dialogue with her. I could imagine what she was thinking, but I couldn't. So it's really, it's a book that I take responsibility for. I was happy to put her name on the cover. Her family wanted that, and she had the idea for a book on the Clinton administration. That was her idea, and hey, yeah, good idea.
I was going to say, you wrote pretty much the entire book. So I'm glad you did, because this book is really timely. I was so happy to read it because, I lived through this period, although I was a teenager when Bill Clinton was elected, so I wasn't paying too close attention to politics. But having lived through it, I wanted to see if what you wrote squared with my memories of what was happening at the time. But also, we're talking a lot, if you've noticed, Nelson, we talk a lot these days about the health of American democracy, the fate of our republic, the problems with capitalism, right? These are the issues you cover in A Fabulous Failure. Some of these really important economic issues receive less attention, provoke fewer op-eds than, say, Trump's personality or his desire to destroy democracy as his critics see it, and the debate over American fascism and the wars in Ukraine and the Middle East now. But, we're often told Ukraine is a front line in a global struggle between democracy and autocracy. But at least in my view, your book is a reminder that the coming election is going to be decided about these economic concerns that are in many ways the same ones that you cover from the 1990s. Do you see it that way?
Well, you're right that sort of headline issues, whether it's Trump's legal problems, these sort of jump out at us, and they do have an emotional impact and move votes and things like that. If you're looking at sort of the kind of the underlying long-term sort of structures of American economy and life, really, some of the issues that I'm discussing in this book are important. I mean, Iowa, as we speak today, is the caucuses. I have no idea how they're turning out. But, Iowa used to be a kind of a industrial state. It was and therefore there was a kind of purple state, I guess you'd call it. Now it's not. I mean, so the deindustrialization of certain areas of the country, have profound long-range impacts way beyond any particular election cycle or any particular president. So that's some of the things I'm trying to get at. Why is that? And I think that, of course, the slogan famously of the 1992 Clinton campaign was "The economy's stupid," put up on the war room of the Clinton campaign by James Carville, kind of became a famous slogan. Well, what he meant was, ultimately the economic issues are more crucial than say some cultural issue. Now, whether that's true or not, I mean, who knows? Maybe we're testing that these days, but I do think in some broad, long-range term that is correct. So you're right that underlying economic structures which have devastated parts of industrial America, have created inequality, et cetera. These have these long-range geological structures.
Clinton is on the cover of your book with the big title, A Fabulous Failure, so maybe you're going for the more conservative readership out there. But the book really isn't only about him and his politics. It is about these structural forces, as I mentioned, that we're still talking about today. We're still living with the consequences of these things, say, NAFTA. We'll get to NAFTA in a little bit. For some time now on my podcast, I've been talking about the importance of reassessing the excessively optimistic 1990s, at least among policy experts or intellectuals like Francis Fukuyama. But I think at the level of ordinary citizens, would you say that as the 1990s unfolded, a lot of Americans saw the country going in the wrong direction?
Well, yes. I mean, actually, the one point I want to make is that, at least on the Democratic side and some Republicans, others, they did not see the end of the Cold War as a moment of triumphalism. That's sort of the Reagan view there. But no, the Clinton people and others saw it, as we have a problem. Economic growth is stagnating and incomes are stagnating. Paul Tsongas, who ran against Clinton, well, Clinton and Tsongas were on the cover of Time magazine. At one point, Tsongas said, "The Cold War is over. Germany and Japan won." And that was something Clinton that he agreed with. We have a problem, and let's look at other countries, other models of capitalism, the Japanese version, the German version, the Swedish, et cetera. Clinton was a world traveler in the 80s, and he was not looking at diplomatic Cold War things. He was looking at how do you make cars in Germany? How do you make radios and TVs in South Korea and Japan? And he wanted to, figure out how to bring some of that stuff back to Arkansas. So the title of the book is partly a riff on a kind of short book that Janet Yellen, currently Secretary of Treasury, and Alan Blinder, a very important economist at now Princeton, they wrote a small book at the end of the year 2000 called A Fabulous Decade, and of course they didn't know what was going to come. There was the dot-com bust that was going to come. There was the meltdown of 2008, et cetera. But nevertheless, whether it was partly Clinton's doing, but also other events, there was low unemployment and a booming stock market by the end of the 1990s. We'll get to that.
Yeah. Were you surprised about the way the history looked as you wrote it versus what you remembered when you lived through the decade?
Right. Good question. Kind of embarrassing, really, because, I was an adult. I was teaching at the University of Virginia. I was reading the New York Times every day, or the Washington Post anyway. But I missed a lot. I mean, just things I should have known about. I mean, when it came to me, I wrote about the East Asian financial crisis. It was like I was doing medieval history. I had no idea what was going on, and I pulled 6 books out of the library just to get an overview. And then of course, what I did is I went into the Clinton library. I wrote this book during COVID. So luckily it was all online and I could then get into it. But sure, I mean, something like that, I should have known about, but I was totally ignorant. We all are. We can't keep up with everything. The whole issue of the end of Glass-Steagall, Elizabeth Warren and others, and maybe Bernie say, oh, yeah, we should not have ended the Glass-Steagall Act, which separated commercial from investment banking and really led to kind of speculation. I sort of knew that as a kind of slogan, but when I actually got into it, it turned out Glass-Steagall was being abandoned and undermined for a decade and a half before Clinton came along. Things like that. There were a number of things of that sort. The importance of Robert Rubin. I just sort of, he's a Goldman Sachs capitalist, but, I didn't really think about it. And then I got into what made him tick and why he was very popular, actually, even among liberals. You kind of get into things that just missed you. And none of us can keep up with everything. Even your college professor who should know this stuff, you just can't.
Well, I appreciate the fact that you stayed away. Well, you had to mention these things, but you stayed away from the scandals as a major part of the narrative. There in the background, you mentioned how they influenced what was going on at any one time as far as the political dynamics in Washington. But, I remember those. I was 17 years old in 1992, so I was already working by the time the Monica Lewinsky thing happened. Your book is about important things.
Actually, I want to mention, the Whitewater was the kind of the scandal which then led to Lewinsky. But it turned out that Whitewater was just one of a whole series of savings and loans that went bust as a result of economic problems. And so I began to talk about the problem of savings and loans and then the problem of financial speculation. And Whitewater was kind of just one example of many. And it was not unusual. There were lots of corruptions of that sort.
Well, something else that happened during this period, Fox News came along. And I remember when it started, and they were all over the Lewinsky stuff. But I'll just share one more thing before we move on to more important matters here. But
this is important.
As you say on page 322, for more than a year, the Lewinsky affair consumed the nation. The Associated Press assigned 25 full-time reporters to the story who wrote more than 4,100 pieces, an average of 11 a day.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky.
You're right. I wasn't going to get into all these scandals and all that stuff. But I do have a little section on Lewinsky, and I think the title of it is, Did Lewinsky Save Social Security? And what was going on, you see, was that in 1997 and 8, Clinton, he'd moved to the right by this point. He had more conservative advisors, and he was dickering around with cutting a deal with Newt Gingrich to sort of begin the sort of privatization of Social Security. They kind of reached an agreement, at least in principle. So then the Lewinsky scandal comes along, and it turns out who is defending Bill Clinton in Congress? Well, it's not the Newt Gingriches for sure. It's the left wing of the Democratic Party, the Barney Frank, who knows something about sex and knows something about finance, and Maxine Walters and all sorts of people of that sort. So Clinton at one point says, oh my God, if I want to avoid impeachment and then conviction, I got to abandon this Social Security thing because my staunchest supporters just hate the idea. So one of the things about Lewinsky was maybe she had the effect of saving at least the beginning of privatization of the Social Security.
That's right. And you remind us that she only wound up in the White House because of the government shutdown. So
right.
Staffers, they needed interns. Okay, so now to important things. The story I'm about to tell here is a familiar one, but we need to go over it again. And I'll be brief, and then I'll let you pick it up at the right point. Because it'll explain the changes in global capitalism and the possible constraints Clinton faced when he finally reaches the White House. So the 1970s, terrible decade. We get stagflation, which is high inflation and slow growth. So you get high unemployment along with high inflation. The oil shocks, etc. New Deal liberalism, Keynesianism looks like they're out of solutions. We get the interest rate shocks that had begun under Carter. He's the one who actually appointed Volcker. Reagan's first term, things are not going well. Interest rates are sky high, all to defeat inflation. They finally come down, but in the process, we get what? Downward pressure on wages, the Reaganist fight against unions, and changes in the U.S. manufacturing base. So by the time Clinton reaches the White House, paint us a picture here of what kind of changes we had seen in American economic life, manufacturing, etc.
Yes, by that time, there was a recession under Bush. The recession was ending, but it was sort of a jobless end of the recession. And there was a lot of mass layoffs, not just of blue-collar workers, but of white-collar as well. So there was a kind of a sense of economic malaise. Reagan, of course, did have a recovery in the late 80s, but it stalled out. That's what Clinton confronted. And he and other Democrats knew that Keynesianism, you mentioned this, was simply not enough. It wasn't enough. Just to increase aggregate demand, well, people would then buy more Chinese products or more Mexican products. So that wasn't going to necessarily revive American manufacturing. And one of the things that have been ruminating around in the Democratic Party, but actually also in parts of the Republican Party, was an idea that went by a number of competitiveness or industrial policy. Clinton actually was, he was in touch with people like Robert Reich and Ira Magaziner and Laura Tyson, his chair of Council of Economic Advisors. And these were all advocates of a kind of targeted investment, picking up winners and losers. I mean, deciding what is the, going to be the winning technology that we should encourage. And so Clinton that was something that he was very much into and thinking about. And so, in that respect, there's a kind of parallelism with what Biden is doing to a degree successfully today. That is, we're going to build chip plants in the Midwest. We're going to build battery plants for electric vehicles. I mean, and we're going to provide lots of money and loans to help do that. Anyway, Clinton was interested in some of the same sort of things. And I should mention here that some of the Republicans around the Commerce Department whose kind of constituency were old, Midwest manufacturing. That's an old Republican base. Well, they were getting hammered. And so people like Malcolm Baldrige, who was Secretary of Commerce under Reagan, he was all in favor of industrial policy as well. So it wasn't just a kind of a left liberal thing. But the alternative vision was more powerful, had more support. And Robert Rubin would put this forward most effectively. He said, look, you maybe, have a few $1 billion to invest in some factory in the Midwest. But what I'm proposing is if we get our deficits down, if we have a balanced budget, then the bond market's going to respond in a terrific way. Interest rates are going to come down, and then you will have $1 trillion worth of investment that's going to pour into the economy. And that was Rubin and Greenspan, who was head of the Federal Reserve. That's what their point of view. And ultimately, Clinton adopted that perspective. Now we did get tremendous, call it investment, with quotes around it, in the 1990s. Some of it became speculative. Some of it just went into the stock market, which boomed. Some of it did go into, certain kinds of investments. Maybe it was retail or hospitality. It didn't go to reindustrialize the Midwest in particular. Yeah. But that was Rubin's mindset, his outlook. The bond market is crucial. We got to get interest rates down. And then investment will just flow into the economy and capitalism will work. And ultimately, at least for that moment in the 1990s, his view carried the day.
And Clinton himself, he didn't run as a deficit hawk, or did he?
No, he did not. No, he definitely did not. Later on, it became a big issue, partly at Rubin's prodding. But no, he did not. He ran on health insurance. He ran on the idea of putting people first. That was the name of his program, which meant let's revive the economy. He ran on issues of a sort of a middle-class tax cut, taxing the wealthy. They did, by one vote, pass that budget, which did increase taxes on the wealthy. And
he wanted to do a stimulus plan upon taking office as well. But
he wanted that, but that went by the wayside in the debates in 1993.
Yes, because everyone became obsessed with deficit reduction.
That's right.
So he seemed to get caught up in this too, which was, I guess, surprising in retrospect.
Clinton, look, he's like any politician. He's, a combination of idealism and opportunism. I would make one point here that I think where my book is kind of revisionist in a sense. There's this thing called the Democratic Leadership Council, which really came out of the South, emphasized culturally conservative questions, welfare reform, for example. And usually, Clinton was a DLC guide, Democratic Leadership Council. In fact, he wasn't. He used them as much as they used him. He was not like an opponent of them, but he was not their creature either. To one degree, my book is revisionist in the sense that I do see Clinton as more of an authentic liberal, at least of a sort, than some other historians or journalists, for that matter, have.
And I found it difficult to pin down his ideological inclinations or his economic outlook because, as you say, he was a politician. He was a very
Right,
talented one, and he
right.
was flexible as well. But just going back again to the beginning of his presidency, deindustrialization is already well underway, of course, and there's already pressure, companies wanting to move overseas where there's cheaper labor. Within Clinton's circle and among Democrats and liberals, these were the debates, right? I mean, how do we revive manufacturing? Should we move away from what would have been called New Deal liberalism to some kind of the New Democrats, right?
The issue on trade was always, what's the criteria upon which we're going to have more trade? I mean, are we going to have protections or make sure that governments like, Mexico or China, for that matter, that they don't just dump stuff on America, or that there's a reasonable degree to which they give their working class a kind of freedom of association and the capacity to raise their own wages. Interestingly, Nancy Pelosi, partly because she came from San Francisco, where there's a big Chinese community, she was very consistent and very tough-minded on trade with China. If we're going to have trade with China, she said, we've got to have a structure of human rights that's protected there, because otherwise, we'll be trading with companies who are taking advantage of their own workers. And she was very good at that. Of course, after Tiananmen Square, there was a great uproar in America about the repressive Chinese regime. And actually, initially, Clinton also agreed with Pelosi. But in 1994, basically, he said, we're not going to put any conditions on opening trade with China. It'll automatically, this was the argument, trade will automatically create a kind of civil society and a free press and things of that sort. But Pelosi was tough. And I have to say that this is something I knew nothing about. I didn't know that. And she was tough and consistent. She had this phone call with Clinton when she said, look, I'm a loyal Democrat, that's for sure. But as far as I can tell, there's no difference between your policy and that of George Bush or Ronald Reagan when it comes to trade. Yeah. So she was very tough on this.
Well, you quote Thomas Friedman from a column he wrote in the New York Times in those days, saying that China will one day have a free press.
Yeah, right. I mean, the logic of that was, and this is a kind of a debate, big debate, going back to Adam Smith, about the nature of capitalism. That is, if you're going to have a capitalist economy, then you got to have a stock market, and then, or something like that. And then you're going to have accurate reporting of company profits and losses. Well, if you have that, then you're going to have a commentary on that in the press. And then eventually, if you want capitalism to work, you're going to have that circulation of ideas. They ran with that. And Clinton and all of his people around him, I mean, just have statements of the sort that just seem embarrassing today about what will China turn into, and, et cetera. And Gene Sperling, by the way, who's currently in the Biden administration and actually is helping to run the kind of the industrial policy that Biden's doing, which is a way of really being more independent and not depending on China for some of these goods. I mean, he was terrible, as far as I'm concerned, in this kind of Panglossian view of what will happen inside China if we have free trade back in the Clinton period.
No, the Chinese were under no illusions about what would happen. They were going to keep twisting the screws of repression while they welcomed in outside investment. And, in those days, everyone was concerned about Japan. Today, it's China. But there's a big difference there. The Japanese did not want to open. Well, first of all, they were already an established economy. Right.
Yeah. And I have my chapter on Japan is called "Managing Trade with Japan: A Detour on the Road to Neoliberalism." And there was a big debate. It had been going on for years. What's the nature of Japanese capitalism? I mean, is it just like ours, or is there something different? And and of course the government played a more intrusive role. And the Clinton people came to the conclusion there was no way that free trade would actually just work with Japan. You had to cut deals with the Japanese government to say, look, we want $10 billion worth of auto parts sold next year in Japan. And we expect you to do that, the government. Or we want, 20% of your market in chips. We want to produce them. So they was kind of managed trade. And they really worked at that for 2 or 3 years. The Japanese economic collapse in the mid 90s sort of ended that moment. But the Clinton people were not free traders when it came to Japan. That's for sure.
Neither were the Reaganites. So, returning to the key question here, the question that these people were grappling with in the early 1990s, what kind of economy do we want to have? If, again, we can't go back to the old New Deal ways and Keynesianism, where will workers fall in all of this? Because if we want more trade, we want free trade. If we want the free flow of capital into and out of developing countries, if we want a modern economy with workers who are technologically savvy, educated, etc., the unions never really seemed to factor heavily into Clinton's outlook. He wasn't anti-union, but he also didn't prioritize unions.
No, you're right about that. He comes from Arkansas, and frankly, he and Hillary were really terrible on union questions in Arkansas. I mean, of course, it is a southern state. And the other side of that is that, unfortunately, the unions in this period, they're really at their nadir, not just in terms of economic strength, but kind of with ideological, social, cultural attractiveness. I mean, the old guard was running the show. And then, when it came to race or gender, this was not a good period for the union. So a lot of liberals of all sorts, Robert Reich, for example, was very uninterested and critical. And the real crucial thing is we're having a new economy, high technology. So let's educate American workers, give them skills. That's the solution. We don't really need unions, or they aren't that important. And the sense that there's a new economy coming and that being highly skilled, that's all you need. That's all you need. Now, one more thing, which is I found really interesting, was Alan Greenspan's point of view. Now, Greenspan was no liberal. He came out of the Ayn Rand School of Economics. And Greenspan, as head of the Fed, and one reason we had a boom in the late 90s was Greenspan kept interest rates low, meaning he thought, well, we could have a booming stock market and a low unemployment and not inflation. Now, the reason he thought that was twofold. One, he very much was onto this new economy idea, meaning that productivity was going up anyway, so we could afford, you wouldn't have inflationary pressures if you had low unemployment. But the second reason was even more interesting. He thought that as a result of PATCO, the destruction of that union in the early 80s by Reagan,
that I must tell those who failed to report for duty this morning, they are in violation of the law. And if they do not report for work within 48 hours, they have forfeited their jobs and will be terminated.
And the tougher line that all companies were taking toward workers, and this was his phrase, American workers are traumatized. That's what Greenspan, they are traumatized. They're fearful of, asking for a wage increase, et cetera. And therefore, we can have low interest rates and we won't get much wage pressure because, workers are afraid. This conversation took place in the Federal Reserve when the Teamsters Union won a big strike victory in 1997 over UPS. And the conversation on the Fed was, oh, is this the end of PATCO? Is this the end of the traumatized workers? Oh, this is terrible, And it turned out not to be the case, but I just found them, very interesting that was exactly what they were discussing.
Well, Clinton was certainly no champion of organized labor, but back to the structural issues, which are just as important, if not more important. The waves were not running in labor's favor. I mean, if you're going to have businesses seeking to outsource and ship jobs overseas, ship their manufacturing plants overseas, that's going to put downward pressure on American wages. So almost an impossible situation.
Yes, it was globalization. As I say, in the debates over NAFTA and in the debates over China entering the World Trade Organization, there were those who put forward ideas, okay, we have to have protections for labor rights and protections at home. I mean, that idea was there, but it was defeated. It was not
side agreements. You could try to slip it in.
Right. That's right. Yeah.
Well, the Mexicans went crazy. Their government said there's no way you can force us to adopt your labor rules.
That's right. Yeah. From the Mexican point of view, I mean, the last thing those governments wanted was to have independent unions or a feisty working class. They'd spent decades creating this machine. The recent Mexico-Canada agreement that Trump actually negotiated is actually much better than the NAFTA when it comes to labor rights in Mexico for a variety of reasons.
Well, let's talk about NAFTA because that was a big one in Clinton's first term. You write in the book that the actual number of jobs that floated away to Mexico were relatively small, about 1 million over 20 years.
Yeah.
But there were still some negative consequences about NAFTA. It's just that we're talking about the wrong ones. So in retrospect now, what's your verdict on NAFTA?
NAFTA itself, it wasn't really a giant sucking sound.
You can move your factory south of the border, pay $1 an hour for labor, hire a young 25, that's assuming you've been in business for a long time. You've got a mature workforce. Pay $1 an hour for your labor. have no health care, that's the most expensive single element in making a car, have no environmental controls, no pollution controls, and no retirement, and you don't care about anything but making money, there will be a giant sucking sound going south.
I mean, some very light industry, did go to Mexico, et cetera. But basically, there wasn't. I mean, as I say in the book, China was where the real problem went. But, of course, Mexico was right on our border. And one of the provisions of NAFTA was that American agricultural products would flow easily into Mexico, and they were produced by these big agribusiness firms, whether it's rice or even beans or corn. I mean, they could undercut peasant agriculture in Mexico. So one effect of NAFTA was tremendous unemployment and bankruptcy of peasant farmers. They would go to the cities and then they would go to the border. So NAFTA was toxic, of course, because of the racial and immigration aspects of it. It encouraged, mass migration to the border because we had destroyed the livelihoods of Mexican peasants. And I think that probably had more impact than the number of actual jobs of American manufacturing that was lost to them,
Well, that perception is reality, of course, and NAFTA became a cultural touchstone of sorts, and Trump rode that wave. I remember when in 2016, he went to the Carrier air conditioning plant in Indiana, which was a subsidiary of a company that was threatening to go to Mexico, but that was the consequence that I think you pinpoint in the book. Companies can now threaten to leave and drive down the wages of their workforce without ever having to actually leave the country.
That's right. By the way, I should say that when it came to these trade bills, the Democrats in the Congress became increasingly skeptical. Clinton was relying on Republican votes to pass these trade bills, not Democratic votes. Clinton was a terrible party leader. He was a terrible leader, and he divided it. And he had people like Gephardt, who'd once been in the DLC and viewed himself as an ally of Clinton when it certainly came to health reform. But on trade, he just became a big opponent. And Clinton divided the Democrats on this question.
So has the U.S. benefited from NAFTA then?
Well, it depends on who you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
You can put automobile factories in Mexico, and they have, and they produce a quality product, which is then shipped back to the U.S., and that does take place. I mean, let me say this about trade. All economists are in favor of free trade, and Alan Blinder made this point on the CEA during the Clinton period. He said, look, yes, free trade will reduce the price of the goods, across the board. So what you get is a generalized moderation of prices of, say, consumer goods, but no one really notices that, or maybe you notice it a little bit. What free trade does, which is very deleterious, is the burden, the cost of free trade is very targeted. This factory in this town goes bankrupt, and that's extraordinarily visible, whereas the fact that some toy is 1 penny less, you don't notice that. But the people who pay for it, they notice it really strongly.
Because as you know, the free trade regime, the neoliberal order, and we're going to return to what that word actually means, is blamed today for accelerating the deindustrialization that was already well underway. And of course, the current narrative is, well, that's how we wound up with Donald Trump in the White House in January 2017.
Yes, this is a problem. I mean, there's a reason that these Midwestern states that used to be centers of social democracy in a way are now, tipping in different directions. And it's not something that can be solved in one election cycle. But I think that clearly the idea of free trade is not some sacrosanct idea that we have to adhere to or that everything will go bust. And that's not the case at all. And by the way, of course, our trading partners, the East Asian regimes, often they were not free traders in no way, shape, or form.
Well, the U.S. was the global economic hegemon. Why would we put up tariff barriers? That's what countries trying to catch up to us would do. Protect their markets against our things. But I'm no economist. All right, healthcare reform. Another one we're still dealing with today. We still don't have universal health insurance or a single payer system. We're closer now with Obamacare, although Obamacare is very much a private health insurance system that's subsidized by the government, if you will. But, the thing about the Clinton healthcare reform that I found fascinating reading your book is that there were so many different segments of the American economy and society that were for it, especially companies like, help us, we're getting buried here. Everyone seemed to want it, yet it didn't happen.
What we want to do is preserve what's right about our system and fix what's wrong. We think one of the things which is right is the employer-employee system, which does work well for most Americans. Its biggest problems have been that the cost of insurance has made it more and more difficult for many businesses to be able to participate.
But we just can't blame Hillary Clinton or blame Republican obstructionists. There were a lot of people who screwed that one up.
Right. The Clinton people and the firms and others who were in favor of it, they saw this as industrial policy. If American automobile companies are paying more money for health insurance than steel, well, this is a competitive disadvantage, and et cetera. Chrysler and Ford, et cetera. Lee Iacocca, was totally in favor of major health reform. Douglas Fraser, head of the UAW, at one point said, well, Iacocca sounds like an Italian socialist when he's talking about health insurance. And the Clintons thought, an Ira Magaziner who was there, who'd come out of consulting, by the way. He'd worked for the Boston Consulting Group. He was very familiar with the problems of American industry. They thought, well, look, we're going to put this over because we have these big capitalist enterprises who are in favor of it, who are going to save money. And they would, have saved money with some form of ending the cost shifting, right? Ending the freeloaders, the Walmarts and Pizza Huts. And the big insurance companies, they thought, well, we'll get guaranteed issue, meaning we'll provide health insurance to everyone, but the government will make sure that we have a huge new clientele base. So they thought they had their capitalist ducks in a row, as it were.
Yeah, the employer mandate.
But it turns out the American economy, the Walmarts and the low-wage and low-benefit service firms were becoming much more powerful. They didn't quite understand that, and so there was a tremendous pushback. Now, by the way, initially the Republicans thought, we'll cut a deal. Robert Dole said, we'll cut a deal on this. But the more militant, ideological, and in those days, not just Newt Gingrich, but Bill Kristol in those days, said, no, look, we don't want any expansion of the welfare state. That just is going to entrench the Democrats in power. So you had that ideological side, but I think mainly it was that American capitalism had shifted its basis. And we see it today. This low wage, low benefit is what exists in many places today.
That's right. The union movement now centered on service sector and retail jobs rather than manufacturing. All right. A couple of more here, Nelson Lichtenstein, because, we can go on forever about this. But people should read the book because then they'll get everything in chronological order. You say that the 2008 crash was somehow connected to China's entry into the World Trade Organization.
There was an element of that, in part because industry was working on these joint agreements with the Chinese. And Wall Street, one of the things bringing China into the WTO, which Wall Street really liked, was that Wall Street would capitalize and basically sell stock of all these Chinese state-owned enterprises, like Chinese telecom or Chinese railroads, which are sort of semi-privatized, and then they would sell stock on Wall Street and huge amounts of money would be made, but that also created speculation. But the underlying thing that in part makes Clinton and Rubin and Larry Summers responsible for the 2008 crash, and you remember that was the securitization of housing, the rise of derivatives, so-called derivatives, which are a kind of speculative insurance product. There was a big fight in 1998 and 1999 in the Clinton administration as to whether these derivatives should be regulated more carefully. The proponents of regulation lost, and it was the Robert Rubins and Larry Summers and Wall Street who won. You ended up with trillions and trillions of dollars of these speculative products. No one expected them to crash, but when they did crash, they had an enormous worldwide impact. And this could have been prevented. And everyone in the Clinton administration, including Bill Clinton and Greenspan and Rubin and others, they said, oh, mea culpa, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have done this. Everyone said that, but it was too late.
Those of us who have looked to the self-interest of lending institutions to protect shareholders' equity, myself especially, are in a state of shocked disbelief. Such counterparty surveillance is a central pillar of our financial market state of balance. If it fails, as occurred this year, market stability is undermined.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. No, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well.
Where do you think you made a mistake then?
I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, was such as that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and the equity in the firms.
And we ended up with really a decade of higher unemployment and very slow growth, well, which finally picked up toward the end of the second decade of the 21st century.
Yeah, because when an asset bubble bursts, cutting interest.
Yes. I mean, the derivatives were a gigantic asset bubble. And the other thing about, you mentioned Keynesianism. Keynesianism wasn't working. We didn't have it. But we did have what some economists have called asset-based Keynesianism. That is, if the stock market's going up, if housing prices are going up, this is in effect a kind of Keynesian motor. People think, I'm rich, I got money because these assets are now more valuable, so I'll either borrow against them or I'll just spend money. And so that was the phrase that I was introduced to, asset-based Keynesianism, in the 90s and after.
The excessive commodification of credit. All right. Now I sound fancy over here. Okay, a couple more, Nelson. Did Clinton betray liberalism? And if you think he did, what options were available or what other roads were not taken, given the structural constraints, changes in global capitalism that were underway? It seemed like he wanted to go along with these changes. He was for this.
Yes, although every so often, I think his residual progressivism, which he'd gotten, back in the 60s, would come to the fore every so often. I think he did betray liberalism. I do think that. And I think that there were realistic possibilities, which wouldn't have required like a revolution or something, to have had a different policy. You could have had a much bigger stimulus, even better tax regime, and a regulation of derivatives. You could have had that. That wasn't hard. Canada regulated derivatives, and they didn't have a bust. Rubin was wrong. Rubin was wrong just empirically and historically that a balanced budget was needed to bring down interest rates. Interest rates were falling every decade from the Volcker shock of 1980 and 81, all toward just the last couple of years. Interest rates were just falling for a variety of reasons. Everyone in the world wanted to park their money in the U.S. and labor was weak and et cetera. So Rubin was wrong. So yes, there could have been other policies which would have been better. And again, it wouldn't require a Bernie to be president. It just could have happened, and it didn't happen. And I think you can fault Clinton and some of people in his team as well.
Because there were some challenges there that probably were hard to overcome, if not impossible. For instance, having the Chinese raise their labor standards to ours. Multinational corporations were as powerful, if not more powerful, than political parties in these days. They wanted cheap labor in China.
Yes, and very interestingly, there's a lot actually need to be more done on this. The Chinese, in the mid-90s, when they wanted to get into the WTO, which would open a lot of investment, they really almost semi-corrupted a lot of American corporations, gave them good trading deals. And basically, the quid pro quo for that was, we want you to lobby the American government to get China into the WTO and have most favored trading status. And, you can see this from Boeing and General Motors, and these companies are just become lobbyists for the Chinese government. Oh, and Bill Gates, you can just see this. It's right
That's
there.
That's right. You had a quote from him about meddling. I'm paraphrasing. We can't meddle in China's internal affairs. So they may have the worst human rights record ever, but tough. We need the market. What is neoliberalism?
Yeah, this is a word that now is probably overused. I mean, neoliberalism would mean this. The state would help facilitate various forms of free trade, of capital mobility, of unregulated markets. Now, I say the state, the difference between classical 19th century economic liberalism, which was basically laissez-faire. The state will be tiny in like Great Britain or the U.S. in the 19th century. In the late 20th century, the state will be powerful. The state will help construct markets which are advantageous to banks and corporations and what have you. You need a powerful state to deregulate. And that's what the meaning of neoliberalism is. Now, again, it becomes a muddy concept. It gets overused. Does it mean the evisceration of the welfare state? Not necessarily, because Rubin, for example, who's unquestionably a neoliberal, was in favor of a welfare state, a modest one, but he was against the welfare reform that Clinton put forward. I don't want to stake my book or my reputation on the meaning of particular definition of neoliberalism. It's very muddy.
I spend a lot of time talking about what fascism is, and after a while, it's like, all right, enough of this definition stuff. Let's just talk about what's actually happening. So, well, I think I'm with you in that there was no going back to the old way of doing things, but some of the negative consequences could have been mitigated with more progressive policy, because at the time there were people saying, if you do this, we're going to have X, Y, and
That's right.
Z.
There were debates. That's right.
Final question to you. From page 206 of your book, you state, the economy grew, talking about Clinton's time in office.
Yeah.
The economy grew for 116 months. Economic growth averaged 4% a year. 22 million new jobs were created, almost all in the private sector, and unemployment fell to less than 4%, its lowest level in more than 30 years. The stock market almost tripled, the Dow rising from 3651 at the passage of the Clinton budget in 93 to 10,788 at the end of his term, almost 27% a year. Home ownership reached its highest rate on record. Inflation remained at levels not seen since the Kennedy administration, and real wages grew even for those at the bottom of the income ladder, thereby slashing the poverty rate from above 15% to less than 12%. I don't want to read the entire book in the podcast, but you're basically saying this was morning in America again, not Reagan in 84. So you say this, but we also say there was a failure. Square that for me.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to make absolutely clear that yes, the late 90s were a very favorable moment. They call it the Goldilocks economy, not too hot, not too cold. But I do think, and the whole point of the book is that this was sort of built on sand to a degree, and it was not built on a sturdy economic policies. There was a great deal of speculation, this asset-based Keynesianism, which was stimulative, which was there. So there would be bubbles that would come along and would create chaos under the second George Bush administration and after. So that is the point. And it didn't have a sturdiness to it of the sort that I think the economic growth beginning in the late 40s for 3 decades or 4 decades did have a kind of solid base. And here I do think a powerful labor movement, one which sustains purchasing power and high wages and real high wages, is essential. And it kind of disciplines capitalists, frankly. When Sean Fain says these companies are have made billions and billions of dollars and we want part of it, it's sort of telling the capitalists, hey, don't do all these stock buybacks. Don't do this speculation because we want our share, And I think that's something that was missing, very much missing in the late 90s.
You're referring to the head of the United Auto Workers there.
Right.
Well, I think that's the paradox we're still dealing with today, if that's the right word. The aggregate numbers are great, yet there is a sense among many people that American capitalism, really global capitalism, is not working as well as it should be.
Let me say something about inequality. We talk, or the 99%. And that's right. You get these billionaires, trillionaires practically. But what's equally devastating to ordinary people is the growth of inequality within the working class. And one of the motivations of the recent automobile strikes in the fall of 2023, yes, it was, the heads of General Motors were making too much money and all this, but it was the inequalities, the different wages, the different conditions of work of people working in the same factory or in the same industry. And that had a kind of visceral irritation. That's something that is motivating, today, a certain kind of worker militancy. That kind of inequality had been growing as well in the 80s and 90s, and the Clinton administration didn't do anything really to stop that. They were, in fact, in favor of outsourcing and fissuring and that sort of thing.
The culture of our political economy underwent a transformation from the 70s into the 80s, and this is why historian Sean Wilentz places the Clinton presidency within the context of the age of Reagan. And as you say, with the newfound labor movement of today, we're pushing back against that a little bit. Ideas that progressives hold dear, they became unpopular. Unions, unpopular. High taxes, although high polls show that, but you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I mean, there's the ideological side of this. The Clinton people were not cultural warriors of the sort that Buchanan or some of the Republicans were, issues of abortion and guns and crime. They were not culture warriors, but they had their own set of ideas which were kind of neoliberal. One element of neoliberalism I didn't mention was sort of the sense that technology is going to solve problems for us. We don't have to sort of do anything. We're just going to, let technology solve problems. And the rise of Silicon Valley was almost an aphrodisiac when it came to that kind of, issue. And they very much were on board with that. Al Gore, he might have been an environmentalist, and he was, but he was very much onto that. And I think that's an illusion. And lots of historians and sociologists today are now looking at how does technology actually work? And it's a handmaiden of capital is what it is. And nothing different between a loom in 1820 and a AI in 2020. They're technologies which can be captured by one social force or another.
Historian Nelson Lichtenstein. And again, the book is A Fabulous Failure. And my review of that book will appear in the Washington Times on Friday, February 26. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Trump, Putin, Netanyahu, Hamas, and palingenesis. Huh? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.